Do you want to know how to edit night images like those you see on Instagram? I've been editing images for years, but over the last 12 months, posting to Instagram every day, there's a few things that I've learned along the way. In my DMs and comments, I've received a few questions asking how I've gone about editing some of my night images, and there's a few things that I'd like to break down. So here's how I edit my night images to make them look more moody and cinematic. So this is the kind of edit that we're going to end up with, and this is where the image started off. So the first thing that I like to do is picking a theme of how I want the image to look. And by that, I just mean a general direction that I want to take the image. I find this just focuses my editing sessions. Sometimes I do go in and edit flying by the seat of my pants, but that's few and far between. For the most part, I kind of go into these editing sessions knowing how I want the end image to look. So the first thing that I like to do is go through my basic correction, dialing in the exposure where I want it, dialing in the white balance where I want it, and then I start building on top of those for the rest of the edit. For this, I'm just going to use one of the presets because it's what worked on the last time. So I'm going to select the fluorescent because there's a lot of fluorescent lights around. If I did want to dial that in a little bit more, I can fine tune it to where I want it. But for now, I'm just going to leave that as is. So moving on to the tones and the general exposure of the image. Generally, I'll always boost the shadows and blacks and also drop the highlights and whites. Sometimes I just find this helps to give a bit more of a flatter image to work with. And yes, it does take a lot of the contrast out of the image, but the way that I go about using the tone curve is how I add a lot of the contrast back in. So although to start the edit off, I do take a lot of that contrast out, I will be adding it back in when we get down to the tone curve. Typically, boost the shadows to somewhere between 60, 70, and the same with the blacks. Sometimes the blacks nowhere near as much. And then drop the highlights and shadows down to somewhere in the region of -65. Every image has its own set of requirements. So far, it's looking pretty minging, but just trust the process. Once I've dialed in those, I'm just gonna skip the present section here just to add in a little bit more of that contrast that I was talking about before that I add in through the tone curve. So I'm gonna start by putting a little S-curve in each of the channels. Now we've added those S-curves in, so let me just flick through those. So we've got the point curve here, we've got the blacks raised just ever so slightly, just to add a little bit of a fade to those blacks. Got the shadows pulled down, the midtones boosted, and same with the highlights. Sometimes, depending on the edit, I will pull the highlights down or the whites down a little bit further just to give it a bit more of a filmic look. And then what I've done is I've kind of started to introduce tones and colors through the tone curve here. So as you can see, I've got slightly different S-curves on each of them. And this is just pushing different tones into different areas of the image. Next thing that I'm going to do before I start fine tuning my colors, I'm going to take a look at my camera calibration and I'm just going to start the foundation of those colors. So for camera calibration, I'm going to put it somewhere on there. Again, this changes from image to image, but you kind of get a really strong look using the camera calibration right out of the gate. So there it is without camera calibration, and then add in the camera calibration. You can just see some of those tones have started to kind of blend a bit more harmoniously, so there's less odd tones in there. So in St. Paul's there, you can see there's little sparks of yellow and whatnot, whereas I've used the camera calibration to push those all to be a very similar color tone. So now going back up to the top, I'm going to start working from presence down, and then before we start looking into color grading and the actual colors themselves. Overall, for the most part of my images, I think digital images sometimes have a tendency to be too sharp. So I often reduce the clarity and texture a little bit. Normally clarity I'll take down to somewhere around -30, and then texture, somewhere around -15, -10. Just somewhere in that region. I think it just takes away a little bit of that digital edge and just kind of gives it a bit more of a kind of dreamy glow, especially on night images. You can use the dehaze to add a little bit more haze in your images. which for this one I'm not going to use, but you do have the option to kind of just create a bit of a softer look using the dehaze. Vibrance and saturation, I will typically boost the vibrance a little bit whilst also dropping the saturation. Next up, let's take a look at the color mixer, and this is where the magic really starts to take shape. So I typically like to go through each of the colors and deal with them one by one, and then dial in each color to where I want it. I think you'll notice on some of the images that you'll see on Instagram, there's a real tendency to use a solid set color palette, and using the color mixer really helps to dial in those colors to get the particular tone and look that you're going for, especially combined with color grading. So I'm just going to go through each of the settings on the color mixer, and then we'll come back and I'll talk you through what I've done. So if I just flick through some of these, I'll talk you through. So say the oranges, I've pushed a little bit more to the yellows because, as I mentioned before, there was a little bit more yellow in here. So pushing those over, so if I push them over to the reds, you can start to see where it starts to break up with the reds in there. So what I like to do is push that and I try and work it where it gets to, where it works well with the other colors in the image. Same with the luminance and saturation. I dial those in case by case to each specific image, and it can be handy, as I was doing then, if you are looking for what a color does or what a slider is particularly doing to the image. In this instance, you'll notice if I pick the huey oranges, you'll see the little bit in the background there shifting, but by using the slider and sending it to its extremes, you can identify quite easily what's actually manipulating, and then you can dial those in to take their final form. So same with the yellows, just taking those, and again, you'll see it's editing similar areas of the image, but by pushing those a little bit more to the orange. So we've pushed the oranges more yellow, and then we're pushing the yellows more orange. So they're working and blending a little bit better together. Greens, for the most part, I don't like greens in my images. So in a lot of cases, greens are ultimately desaturated all of the way. And same with the magenta and the purples, to be honest. I just desaturate them in a lot of cases. So just switching to the aquas, you'll notice it's especially around the jeans. So from time to time, I'll move it a little bit more green or more blue, but depending on each particular image, this one might vary, because in this instance, all the subjects in the frame have got denim jeans on. This impacts them quite a lot. So you can end up with quite a greeny blue, or you could end up with a bluey blue. I kind of push this somewhere around plus 14. I have desaturated that because of what we did in the camera calibration. It was pushing those greeny aquas to be a little bit more prominent. So just desaturating those. But also one thing I like to do is when I desaturate, I boost the luminance ever so slightly just to compensate for that loss of color. So with the blues, again, just pushing a little bit more over to the purple side, but that's just trying to normalize what's going on in the jeans with a little bit of a desaturation again, just so it's not too in your face. Blues are one of those that picking the wrong blue or picking a too saturated blue really sticks out in an image. So as I touched on before, just the purples and the magentas I've just desaturated completely. So we're on the home stretch. So the next thing that we're going to take a look at is the color grading. And this is one of the most powerful tools in Lightroom, but it is also one of those ones that even the slightest tweak has a drastic effect. So always edge on the side of caution with things like this. I typically have my go-to settings for this, so I'm just going to key those in. So the hue is normally somewhere around 235. I normally try to keep this below 20. So let's start with 20, and you can see how much blue that's actually adding to the image already. So I'm just going to drop that down so I can see and get a little bit more control over these. But you can see there how much blue gets added through that. So in this instance, I'm just going to take it up to maybe 18. But yeah, normally I try not to push it past 20 because I find sometimes it just starts to overtake the image. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's just something that I like in my style of editing. So moving to the midtones, in this image, I'm just going to leave them as they are. You could push some oranges or yellows in there to kind of make St. Paul's pop a little bit more, but I think in this instance, it does, the kind of colours are working okay. And so what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to put blues in the highlights again. So I'm going to just key these in, and that's 243. And again, keeping the saturation somewhere below 20. So it's 20 at the minute. And you can see the difference that makes. So if I just turn that on, it's only ever so subtle, but you can just see the edges of St. Paul's there. It's just taking that warmth, that greeniness out of it, making it a bit more white and cooler. And so one thing that I like to do with my highlights in the color grading as well is just to boost the luminance ever so slightly, just to give, you can see just where that's affecting, it just gives them a little bit of an extra pop. So I think the image is starting to take shape. So I think the final finishing touches on an image like this is something that I am quite a big fan of, and I think it's one of those things that does add a lot to an image, and that's light shaping. And by that I mean just tweaking the light using masks to kind of dramatize certain elements, make areas darker, make them brighter. We could just add a normal vignette in here, and so let's just go somewhere around -31. Midpoint, could take it quite far in, but then one thing I like to do is take the feather to 100 and also the highlights to 100, just so it doesn't impact those highlights too much, and you can just see the subtle difference that has made. So let's get back to talking about light shaping, and like I say, by this I mean just tweaking the lighting just to kind of give it a little bit more of a dramatic feel. In this instance, you could kind of drag this foreground down to drag the exposure of that down, drag a little bit of the shadows down, just taking the viewer's eye a little bit more towards the subject in the image. So for this instance, I'm just going to leave that there. So next thing, I'm just going to grab a brush, stick it on auto mask. So one thing that you can do is boost the exposure slightly. Sometimes I try not to boost it above 30. It starts to make the images look a little bit too fake. You could drop the contrast a little bit just to take out some of the harshness, depending on your ultimate look. So there's increasing the contrast, reducing the contrast. So I'm just gonna drop it down a little bit. I'm actually gonna drop the blacks. And then one thing that I like to do with the subject is actually increase the clarity to the amount roughly to where I dropped it down to in the main image. So I'll offset that in here. So by boosting it back up. So if I just turn that off and on, you can just see it's such a subtle difference, but it just gives it a little bit more attention inside the overall composition. So the next thing I'm just quickly gonna do in here is just to clean up a couple of these reflections of this, I think it was a crane in the background. So I'm just going to use the remove tool to hide a few of these. Not perfect, just doing a quick job. Not doing this in the instance of making it perfect. You get the idea. You can use some of the tools in here just to create a cleaner, more visually pleasing image. The last thing to do is crop for Instagram. So 4x5, get the frame into roughly where I want it. I think I'm gonna stick those subjects kind of in that middle third. So it's maybe somewhere there. Actually, no, let's drop it down a little bit. Let's end up somewhere like that. So the headline is somewhere center. Yeah, somewhere there. And so what we can do with that is we can take these settings and apply them to a different image. So I'm just going to copy, I'm just going to change my remove settings, And let's just click that. And let's take a different image. Let's take this one and let's reset it. And so if I just go on and paste my settings directly on, you can see half the look's already there. And that's using exactly the same settings that we got going on. So if I just put that back in, one thing I've noticed in this is because I desaturated the greens, the lime logo is actually desaturated. So like I was mentioning before, sometimes you have to take this on a case-by-case basis, but I'm just going to slowly introduce that to somewhere where it actually works nice inside the image. So yeah, somewhere around there looks nice. Let me reset this one, and then let's paste those settings on there. And you can see this is most of the way to where we got it. So I'm just going to crop that back out, drop that down there. And I think all in this instance, where I got the exposure is a little bit too high. So I'm just gonna drop that back ever so slightly, and let's just sort the angle out somewhere around there. And there we have it. Using that, we've been able to, that's the inspiration from one of my images that I took. That's the new edit and crop. Same with this one, quickly click reset. You can see where we started to where we got it to. Same with this one, if I click reset and then undo that, you can see where we got it to. Obviously not exactly the same as my original edit on this one, because I think I dialed in some of the whites a little bit more just to make those whites pop. Also possibly drop those blacks and shadows just to add in a little bit more contrast. But for the most part, that preset just dialed it in for us. Now, once we've got our image finished, we're going to finish this video just talking quickly about how we actually go about our export settings. I'm going to go File, Export, and then what I'm going to do is just talk you through my settings that I like to do. So I'm going to export, in this instance, I'm just going to say desktop, and then I'm not going to put it in a subfolder. But the most important one is when we scroll down, for me anyway, is I'll always stick my quality to 100. Image format is JPEG. And then the other thing that I like to do is I include output sharpening for screen. So I'll go sharpen for screen and I'll leave the amount as standard. There's been loads of different things about people saying you need to export your images at X size or Y size, but for myself personally, I've not really noticed any benefit of changing my export sizes, so I typically just export them as high resolution as possible. I've not noticed any quality difference of uploading my images to Instagram at full resolution or purposefully scaling them. And that's how you edit your night images to look more moody and cinematic. Now it's your turn to give these tips a try and put them into practice. If you found this video helpful, don't forget to like, subscribe, and drop a comment below. If you're looking for more street photography POVs, tricks and tips, make sure you turn on notifications so you never miss a video. Or check out this POV video that YouTube thinks you might like. And with all that said and done, I'll catch you in the next one.